Hello adventurers, this is Craddock, and today we will be talking about Stricken, and we'll be comparing the Ranged CoE MH Hydra build that uses Starfire and Zei with the Melee CoE MH Hydra build that uses Trapped and Fragment of Destiny to sort of compare the Stricken stacks, the multipliers, and sort of analyze the data to see which one is better. Anyway, let's get started. First of all, after looking through all of this data, I realized that to min-max this build, you're going to have to opt for exactly 62.6 without Gogok, so no amulet roll as CDR, you want attack speed there. And if you're trying to min-max this build as well, it is my opinion that you're going to want attack speed on one of your rings, not both of them, just one of them. And this is to hit one higher breakpoint for Stricken, not necessarily to have leeway in your bubble, a little bit more leeway in your Hydra dynamic breakpoint. It is actually to bump you up one Stricken breakpoint, and this is key. So you may be thinking, well, Craddock, well, wouldn't crit hit damage be better there, or crit, for example? Well, let's go the extreme example. In D3 Planner now, let's swap this back to crit hit damage. So the difference here, it says minus 5.41%. So that's in between 5 and 6% damage is what this crit hit damage is worth. My Paragon's, what, 1200, got augments of 90, so this is a very low geared character, but I think it's still a good example. So let's generalize in between 5 and 6% is what this crit hit damage is worth. Now we swap that to attack speed. What do we gain with attack speed? We gain, first of all, Hydra damage, because remember, when we cast our Hydra, it gets imbued, it's snapshot with damage from this attack speed. Now, how do we calculate how much that is? Well, since we're in single stack Swami, our values for that increase, you can see here I've got the AS ring roll damage value. When we're at single stack Swami, which would be right here, and we only have one bubble at the time of casting, we have about 3.29 attacks per second. That's our character attack speed at that time. Now that's with including the extra ring roll. If we get rid of that, it's down to 3.19. These are the values here, and I've divided them out, and that gives us an increase of about 3.2%. So 3.2 is definitely less than 5 to 6%. However, we're also bumped up a Stricken breakpoint, and I feel that both of these two things combined are better for the build. Now, let's talk minimums. With this updated attack speed value, when we have the ring roll and our double stack Swami and our double stretch time, this is the max attack speed you will be hitting with perfect rolls everywhere for this build. The minimum, though, I've already calculated out. I've toned it down and figured out what the lowest amounts are. Rounded up in double stack Swami, you're going to want to hit 4.16. It's a little bit lower, so if you're on the cusp, look at this value instead. Same thing here in single stack Swami, single bubble with Gogok. This is the value you're going to want to be at least at. Same thing here in town, unbuffed, no Gogok, no stretch time. This is the attack speed value you're going to want to be at for hitting the 13 frames breakpoint for Stricken in double stack Swami. Now, you can see this here as well. When we scroll down to, these are Stricken attack speed. This is a Stricken attack speed chart, and this is the number of frames you'll be in at this character attack speed. So we scroll down right here. Here's the breakpoint at 4.16. And you'll notice we typically will be sitting here at 4.19 if we have perfect rolls on gear. So we're barely hitting that breakpoint, but it gives us a lot more Stricken stacking through the course of the fight, and I feel it's very beneficial. Now before we go into the comparison, know that this, in the compare, we are only looking at the Rift Guardian portion of the fight. We aren't looking at the Rift at all. There are too many variables with that, so just keep focused on the Stricken stacking and comparing it to the upfront multipliers of the ranged build. Now here we have a gym level multiplier chart that I've put in with, you can see here's the gym level. As you scale up the gym level, here's what your trap bonus would be, here's what your Zei bonus would be, here's what your Stricken bonus would be. Here is the, and this is pretty important because we're going to have to calculate the difference in multipliers between Zei and trapped. At this level, there is a 15% difference between Zei and trapped. And as you can see, as it scales up, the difference becomes larger and larger because Zei rolls with a higher multiplier as it levels up. Before we get to the simulations, let's move on to some assumptions and definitions. I'll try and get through them quickly. First off, we're going to assume the Ranged CoE MH Hydra build is at the same attack speed breakpoints as the Melee build. This is more to portray a conservative estimate in that the Melee build would be doing better if the Ranged build was at a worse Stricken breakpoint, but assuming they're at the same, it's still going to do very well, and I want to show that. The single target, we have a single target stationary RG with no adds and no pylons, and we assume 0 travel time, even if the build requires travel time in between the phases or cycles. Perfect casting and rotation, meaning the human error portion of the gameplay is removed in the theory. Now, there are two different ways we can think about the ranged build starting a fight. Is basically, one is that the ranged Archon build does not punch during double stack Swami ever, meaning that I call this 0 punch, meaning that they're always going to beam in double stack Swami. One punch is a little bit different. For the first double stack Swami phase, the wizard decides to punch instead of go at range, and this is to stack Stricken faster for that one Archon cycle. And so our simulations will show different results for these two scenarios. Definition: single stack, double stack Swami. Remember that for single stack we only have 1 stretch time bubble, double stack we have 2. An Archon cycle is defined as the full 32 seconds for 20 seconds of Archon and 12 seconds of signature. Now, the Archon phase is comprised of the 8 seconds in double stack Swami and the 12 seconds where you're in single stack Swami. The signature phase is just when the hero is not in Archon form. That's 12 seconds of time. Remember that within the 8 seconds of double stack, 4 of those seconds will be the Lightning CoE phase, and that's also the 8 seconds when Tau 6 should be active. So it's a big multiplier phase, something to keep in mind. We also have 2 theoretical forms for these different types of Archon cycles, and these are also some different scenarios that we'll look at in the simulations, so we'll go over them real quick. Form A is basically the Archon phase in front, and the signature phase on the latter end of that cycle. Form B of the cycle is the signature phase in front, so the reverse of Form A, and the Archon phase at the end. Typically, your ranged CoE Zei Starfire MH Hydra build will be able to kill a single target Rift Guardian with no adds and no pylon in 4 Archon cycles, 4 complete Archon cycles. Now, this is important because it's what we use as a benchmark for comparison when pulling up the Melee build data. I think the Melee Stricken building build is better because the damage multiplier by that 4th Archon cycle is significantly higher than the range build. I also think that the Melee build is better because it's hurt less when you miss your Manal heal procs. There is still a random chance that your Hydra will, not proc for 7 or 8 seconds on end. It's very rare, but it can happen. And when that happens, the faster Stricken stacking build will make up for missing those procs in some lesser degree. We can all agree that if you miss an entire proc's worth of cycle and you don't proc, you are going to be delayed by 1 Archon cycle. Regardless of the build, regardless of the spec here, you will be delayed. Except in the Stricken build, you will have built up more Stricken stacks, and therefore on the next time when you do proc, you will do more damage and therefore have killed the Rift Guardian faster than you would if you were running the ranged build and not procced. See what I mean? So let's move on to calculating our Stricken stacks per second for both our Archon phase and our signature phase. Note here we have both our double stack Swami and single stack Swami attack speed values listed out, similar to what we referenced before. And when you calculate the frames per second based on our Stricken formula, you get 13 and 17. Now, for double stack Swami, the melee build, obviously we're going to be using our punch, so we divide 60 frames per second over our 13 frames per second Stricken breakpoint, and that gives us 4.61 approximate Stricken stacks per second. For single stack Swami, we take our 17 and similarly divide it out into 60, and that's what we get. Now, the ranged build is a little bit different because the Archon beam sort of, you could say it rounds up, so to speak. There is a gap in which you lose, I guess, the rate of Stricken stacking because you're using the beam. And in this case, it rounds up from 13 frames to 16 frames. Just know that that is true. I've found it out in our previous theory crafting session, so this is what it'll be at for double stack Swami with the beam at this attack speed. Now, for single stack Swami, we're punching similar to the melee build, so the value is going to be the same. Just know that since this difference is 0, I haven't included this time period on any of these simulation spreadsheets for that reason. Now, here's the difference. 0.86 seems small, but over 8 seconds can accumulate. And this is why I wanted to roll for the 7% on the ring, is because if you look at 14 frames instead of 13 frames, you get 4.28, which is a difference of only 0.53 as opposed to 0.86. So it's quite a difference there. And I feel the higher ring roll, the higher attack speed with the ring roll will be better. And moving on to calculating Strickens per second for our signature phase, we have Spectral Blade, and we have our Magic Missile. The difference here is because we have Fragment of Destiny in the melee build, that will hit the 11 frames per second max Stricken stacking breakpoint, which is 5.45 about, and the ranged build is still also a speed coefficient equals 1 spell, but is back at the 17 frames per second, which is 3.52. So when you get the difference there, it's a difference of about 1.92 or 1.93 stricken stacks per second, which is huge. So during that 12 seconds, it's going to stack up stricken. The melee build will stack up stricken a lot faster, and so you're going to see that in the simulation. So let's dive into our first simulation here. We're taking a gym level of 100. That's for Trapped, for Zei's, and for Stricken. Anything that we're comparing that would relate to damage is going to be a level 100. I guess this is based around the fact that your gyms will typically be about the same level for whatever clear you're attempting. We've copied over the values from the previous spreadsheet for both the Archon double stack Swami phase and the signature phase. Our stricken percent, if we look at our multiplier chart, is 1.8. The difference between Zei and Trapped is 15%. So Starfire times 60% times the 15% gives you an 84% break even multiplier that has to be made up by the melee build to just simply even out damage with the range build. So it's quite a bit to overcome, but it can be done, I assure you. And so let's get into these charts. This is, if you remember, Form A was with the Archon cycle in front and the signature cycle in the back. And we also have 0 punch, which means that you will always be beaming with the ranged build. So we will always have a difference even with the first cycle for double stack Swami. And you can see here the times in seconds at the end of the cycle. So at the end of the first Archon cycle we have 34 seconds. Oops. We have 64 at the end of the second, and so on and so forth. Basically your fourth cycle would be between about a minute and, what is that, a minute 36 to 2 minutes and 8 seconds. So just kind of keep that in mind. Here's our stricken building periods. I just use this as a multiplier for our stricken stacks. You see here, we're multiplying the 8 seconds in the double stack Swami phase by our stricken stacks per second gain of the melee build over the ranged build for that time period. And we do the same thing for the signature phase. You can see here it's significantly more stricken stacks per second. Sorry, significantly more stricken stacks that are built up over this time period than over the 8 seconds here. We can get a percentage in damage difference by multiplying this value, the stricken stacks per second difference per period, by our percentage damage of stricken, which is pretty cool. So we get multiply that by 1.8 and we get our two values here, and these two values, since we're at the same gym level, will be the same for every chart that we look at on this page for this simulator level, which is pretty cool, but just keep that in mind. Now that we have those values, we can also sum them. So as we go through and move through time, we will sum up these values and get totals for the end of this time period. For example, the end of phase, or Archon cycle 1, we have 54% multiplier, which, if you look at our relative break-even, is still below the break-even. A positive value would indicate a multiplier that is above the break-even by X%. And you can see here we broke even in the signature phase of the second Archon cycle, and we calculated a difference here, or I calculated a difference here based on the 84%. It's basically a remainder in time in this 12-second cycle. We were 5 seconds into this 12-second cycle, so I added that remainder, or it's not really a remainder anymore, it's the first 5 seconds of that 12-second cycle to the previous values, which were 32, and our 20 seconds of Archon from the first Archon phase in the second Archon cycle. And it gives us our break-even time, which was 57 seconds. It's still before the end of the second phase, which is pretty cool. Basically what this means is that by the time you get to the third phase, you will have started dealing higher damage than the ranged build. It doesn't mean you've dealt more damage, it means you will have a higher multiplier at that time. And here you can see it's 24% at the start of phase 3. For phase 4, that increases to 78%. Oh my goodness. So by the time you get to your 4th Archon cycle, which we typically will end up at, you will be dealing almost 80% more damage with this simulation, which is really cool. Now, continuing on. Because of how Form A is formed up, and you have the Archon in front and the signature at the end, you won't be building as many Stricken stacks to get in at higher damage. If you were to, say, enter the fight at the Stricken phase first with Form B, you get more Stricken stacks, so you break even sooner. So this would be, you could say, your worst case scenario, Form A, and Form B would be your best case scenario, where you break even sooner and you're able to start dealing damage quicker, so to speak. You can see here we broke even in the signature phase of cycle 2, which means by the time we're dealing damage in our second cycle, we're already 11% higher above the breakpoint. And by the third cycle, we're at 65 and 120 at phase 4. So you can see how when you enter the fight affects how many stacks you may get. We could generalize and say we'll be anywhere from 40.6 to 57 seconds for zero punch in this gym level 100. Now let's look at one punch. So one punch is a little bit different in that we delayed our Archon cycle in the range build, and we just meleeed during double stack Swami to get extra Stricken stacks. So basically the melee build wouldn't have gained any Stricken stacks for that time period. So you can see here we have 0, and also here we have 0 in Form B. But even in the worst case scenario, we still come out with a break-even before the third cycle, and our fourth cycle, Archon cycle, is still buffed 65.67% over the ranged build once we get to that point. This is why this is the worst case scenario simulation we will see on the spreadsheet, and this is why it's just the inevitability of Stricken wins out, in my opinion. And I hope that's the conclusion you come to as well. But here's Form B, way better, and still very much high values right there. Now, before we take a look at the higher gym levels, let's look at what happens on our multiplier chart when we go up those gym levels. We have a higher Zei and trap difference, so you would expect the break-even to move up. However, that is quite the opposite of what happens, because the Stricken stack percentage overcomes this increase, and you can see it here. So let's go from 100, where we had 57 seconds. For Form A, we now have 56. Where we had 40.6 seconds for Form B, we now have 39.81, going from a level 100 gem to a level 110. Even with the increased 16% multiplier difference on Zei, which results in an 85.6 break-even requirement, these values will be lower here because Stricken is higher. And you can see it here too, 60.64, 44.54, 59, 43, and as we level up the gems even further, push them to 120, we can see our multipliers are just skyrocketing. By the 4th Archon cycle, we have 93% in this simulation. In the worst case scenario, again, we'll still have 80% higher damage than the range build. Huge amount of damage increase, and in our best scenario, 140% increased damage over the range build. So you can see why I could feel this way with the melee build. Anyway, yeah. And that's about it. I want to thank you for watching. I will post a link for this spreadsheet in the description of the video. Hope this has been enough information for you to decide whether you want to opt for that upfront Zei Starfire multiplier with the range build, or if you're like me, you go melee, go for that hidden multiplier at the end of the 3rd and 4th Archon cycles with the Stricken stacking build. Anyway, hope you have a good day, and I'll catch you in the rifts.